Stephen asked me if I'd seen that before I said no, but I think I have. My name is Jim Shedden, and I'm a member of the Ad Hoc Film Collective, along with Stephen Broomer and Bart Testa, who's here tonight, and Maddie Peeler. Welcome to Ad Hoc number 80. We are a collective dedicated to the exhibition of underground cinema, artist cinema, and other marginal cinemas. Tonight we're pleased to be presenting one of our own, that is, one of Ad Hoc's own and an instructor at the Cinema Studies Institute. On the occasion of the publication of Stephen Broomer's long-awaited book on Arthur Lipsett, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, we're pleased to be presenting an evening of Lipsett's films. It's not complete, but Stephen may have some news on that front as well about other films. Stephen has been engaged with Lipsett's filmmaking for many years now. I don't know exactly how he managed to write this book on top of all his other scholarly and creative activities. He is a prolific and wonderful experimental filmmaker, and more recently, a prolific video essayist, hosting 3 series, Art and Trash, Northern Lights, and Detours. He is the founder of the home video label Black Zero, an extraordinary project to restore, preserve, and make available in beautiful Blu-ray classics and buried treasures of Canadian experimental cinema, along with additional material that contextualizes the works. In fact, Arthur Lipsett's Strange Code is among these titles. This is not Stephen's first book. The author of dozens of essays, reviews, and interviews, and the editor of many books on independent cinema, Stephen is the author of Hamilton Babylon, A History of the McMaster Film Board, Codes for North, a book on difficulty in the works of 3 great Canadian artists and filmmakers, Michael Snow, Joyce Whelan, and Jack Chambers, and now this comprehensive study of Lipsett's work. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Stephen Broomer.
Thank you so much, Jim. I promise I won't talk for too long, although I'm probably going to renege on that and talk for a very long time. Before we get to what I'm going to talk about, I wanted to maybe explain that little teaser that you got. That was a film called Anything Can Happen on Channel 6 that was part of Arthur Lipsett's kind of assignment docket at the NFB. It was made in 1960. It was featured in a compilation of various PSAs developed at the NFB called Hors d'oeuvre. And it is one of the few circulatable examples of Lipsett's early work where we see his sensibilities in action. So thank you first to the team at Wilfrid Laurier University Press, Anne Brackenbury, Claire Hitchens, Murray Tong, and especially Siobhan McMenemy, who commissioned this book. Thanks also to the University of Toronto Press bookstore, who are here selling the book tonight. You've seen the table on the way in, I'm sure, and feel free to grab a copy if you feel so inclined. I also want to acknowledge, I've already said rather tackily tonight, that I stood on the shoulders of giants in writing this, and in anything that I've done. I owe a great debt, though, with this book to 2 researchers who came before me in charting the work of, but also the private life and trials of Arthur Lipsett through really remarkable primary source research. And those are Michael Dangsock, who joins us tonight, all the way from Regina. And Amelia Does. Is Amelia here? I don't know. Give her a hand anyway. Amelia wrote a book about Arthur Lipsett, I think it was perhaps a decade ago, that does a wonderful job of weaving his story together with firsthand testimony. It was certainly an inspiration to me as I was developing this book. Their research on the subject of Arthur Lipsett, again, predates mine and deeply informed mine. So thank you both. My thanks, as always, not to repeat what Jim has already said, but to Innis College and Innis Town Hall and Cinema Studies Institute and the staff here. And a great thanks to Charlie and Alberto and Denise Ng and Ian Logan. I also want to just say our staff here is really wonderful. Let's give a big hand for Isabel and Ned. Ned will be projecting tonight. And it is not always an easy thing to project 16 millimeter these days, least of all in a large space like this with a big throw from prints that are inevitably, as Lipsett prints tend to be, former classroom prints. So here's hoping it all goes well. I also just want to briefly acknowledge that this book was made with the support of a really wonderful community. I see many members of that community here tonight. I'm very grateful for all of your support. But I might just say by name Cameron Monio, to whom the book is dedicated, my partner Emmeline and my family, and my very good friends, among them Jim Shedden, Isabella Pruce-Goldenhoff, Clint Enns, and Eva Kolze. My engagement with Lipsett's work has been a long journey. I'll say more on that momentarily, but one of the stops on that journey was restoring his final film, Strange Codes, which was the only independent film he ever made. It's the only film he ever made outside of the National Film Board of Canada. We will see that film tonight. It's the only one that we're not seeing on film. We're seeing it from a 4K DCP. It is one of several titles that I have published on Blu-ray disc through the home video company Black Zero. There will be copies available for sale in the lobby during and after the screening, so if you are a supporter of Canadian experimental films, please consider stopping by the table and making a purchase. I first encountered Arthur Lipsett's films, as many of my generation did, on Canadian television. His films had continued to flourish in broadcast decades after his death, shown interstitially to a country that valued the arts, and for whom such a complex, sardonic vision of humanity might yet be met with knowing laughter. The barrage of image, that style with which Lipsett is most closely associated, had come to permeate the aesthetics of broadcasting, and yet it still seemed new and alive for its wit and its deep illusions, eternally vital in its absurd constitution. I came to know Lipsett's struggles through the shorthand and inaccurate explanations that circulate in film schools. There his rhythms could be celebrated and taught, but the comic overtones of his films, a trait less easy to recognize, let alone to imitate, were rarely acknowledged. With this book, I'm trying to celebrate not only Lipsett's art and technique, but his humanity, which was restless, funny, and wise. Between 1960 and 1975, Arthur Lipsett made 8 films, the bulk of which can be broadly characterized as collages, a mix of original and appropriated images, set to soundtracks that proffer warnings, platitudes, and hysterical testimonies. His films were often concerned with the place of spiritual experience in a civilization matured on science, war, and the mass media of Western atomic age society. But they're also informed by the loneliness of the crowd, an absence of meaning felt by the long faces captured in his street photography, which you'll see a great deal of, especially in his film Very Nice, Very Nice. The films were not declarations of the tragedy of a godless world, or the failure of mass movements, or the terror of the crowd, or the promise of the bomb. They were experiences, often riotously comic, that placed irreconcilable ideals in contrast. They confounded viewers and critics, as well as the government agency that had commissioned them. Most of Lipsett's films were made for the National Film Board of Canada, a federal communications arm whose mission was to represent what constituted good citizenship. His inability to adapt to that work culture, or conversely, the inability of the agency to accommodate him, resulted in a schism that slowly ended his career as a filmmaker. When he took his own life in 1986, he had not completed a film in 11 years and was living in solitude with schizophrenia. The NFB was formed out of the passage of the National Film Act in 1938, an effort on the part of the government to aid in coordination of government film activities. With Canada's entrance into the Second World War, the NFB became a state instrument for mass communication. By the late 1950s, when Lipsett joined, it had transformed into a utility for the dissemination of Canadian culture. personal filmmaking had not found purchase there. While American art cinema was experiencing its first soundings of an organized experimental film movement in the 1940s, the newly founded Film Board was breaking ground in stylistic approaches to cinema as mass communication, establishing conventions through its own conservative experimentation with film form. While it would continue to evolve in new directions, the NFB never abandoned its root mission, an inflexible conceptualization of cinema as an art of communication. Lipsett's films' fractured modernistic treatments of mid-century life were unprecedented in the experience of his colleagues, and they supported them for a time, and insofar as they could define them within the goals of the institution. Lipsett's approach was specialized in the broader context of experimental filmmaking, wherein absurdist themes had been overshadowed by the earnest suffering of the trance film, and later by impulses to cast intimacies, abstractions, and psychedelia. Absurdist humor was seldom proclaimed as a foundational value of experimental cinema, yet it remains as a component of surrealism at the very root of that cinema. An absurdist impulse in American experimental filmmaking flourished in small pockets in the 1940s and 50s. We've seen some examples of that here in the Ad Hoc series, in the work of Sidney Peterson, James Broughton, Christopher McLean. But it became more dominant in the late 1950s, following on the influences of Dada and Surrealist cinema, the American screwball comedy, the growing circulation of absurdist literature and theater, and the emergence of the Neo-Dada movement. It was in these years that the filmmaker Ron Rice wrote a mock manifesto for absurdist film before his own untimely death, and among his contemporaries, filmmakers like Jack Smith, Richard Bartlett, and Carl Linder made films distinctively indebted to the theater of the absurd. Film has a unique capacity for animating the aesthetics of modern literary absurdism, an inheritance of nonsense from the likes of Alfred Jarry, Franz Kafka, Samuel Beckett, Eugene Ionesco, and Albert Camus, benefiting from cinema's ability to place images in immediate contrast to one another, to juxtapose, to operate in time, to declare continuities of action and space, all traits that are ready-made for creative subversion. And further to this, the experimental collage film, what Lipsett came to practice, is distinctively attuned to absurdism for its inevitable undermining of the images that it pilfers and the attitudes, narratives, histories, and archives that those images represent. Like Camus, Lipsett located the absurd in the divorce between ideological convictions and in a recognition that progress was a futile illusion. And like Beckett, Lipsett's humor became a form of heroism in the desolate sunset of the 20th century. And like the protagonist of a Kafka novel drowned by the maddening insouciance of bureaucracy, or a character in an Ionesco play who convinces themselves of a lie through cunning but wrong deductions, Lipsett lived in a fog of trivialities. Absurdism was a natural extension of his affect, his resilient if mordant sense of humor. At the National Film Board, he became something of a pataphysical artist after Jarry, in the sense that his work appeared to speak in an elegant way about serious things, concealing his embrace of illogic in an illogical world, and even, from some viewers, his bemusement at the futility of it all. Lipsett was an absurdist in an era of double talk, exhausting consumerism, and mass movements. He explored these themes through flaneurism, sifting the tortured and jocular faces in the crowd, following in the immediate wake of Robert Frank, in capturing the dispossession and aimlessness of the modern Western face. To some, the stream of consciousness affected in Lipsett's montage was just this: madness and nonsense and the heights of the absurd. To others, straining to pin down an elusive, didactic meaning, the films were reduced to clear and stable commands: resist consumerism, love humanity, find God. Lipsett's films endorsed the premise of the theater of the absurd, which had rejected the search for a model through which to discover fundamental ethical or philosophical certainties about life and the world. His films could embrace ambiguity and still serve as a Jeremiad on the corruption of man. Steeled against ready interpretation, they feature images that provoke rage and compassion without occupying those emotions. even forcing a contradictory tone through the buoyancy of his sound design. He maintained this resistance to ready meaning even as his approach transformed with each new film, an urgent and restless series of transitions, each building on the last. While his films are commonly remembered for a few narrow strategies, no two are perfectly alike. The trajectory of Lipsett's work bears a continuous evolution. Rather than resting on his laurels, he departed quickly from his early success to develop challenging approaches to break new ground. Lipsett wasn't merely an heir to the absurdist streak of the 20th century's literary avant-garde, he was also an aspiring mystic, absorbing the syncretic, omnist take on Buddhism, popularized by Alan Watts and Walter Evans Wentz, as well as the spiritual roots music and avant-garde art musics that he encountered through the Folkways record label. Between his tragicomic relationship with the atomic age and his pantheistic tour of ancient knowledge and ritual, Lipsett shared common ground with the Beats. In his decade-making films, Lipsett's arcane fascinations grew to drown out the social comment of his work, and his colleagues found the results incomprehensible. His spiritual contemplations were matched in his films with themes of technological progress, provoking reflection of the history and future of humankind, guided by a steady interest in cybernetics and the philosophies of Warren McCullough, who we'll see several times tonight. His spiritual and historical interests were neither clinical nor dogmatic, and a clue to how Lipsett saw himself and his work in relation to the whole of the human project, that is, against a backdrop of the great ontological and theological questions, is revealed by his fascination with the time charts of John B. Sparks, published by Rand McNally as Histomaps between 1931 and 1947. Sparks' time charts were oversized vertical timelines. I think you've probably all seen them. They used to hang in classrooms all the time. Timelines that graph the chronological progression of vast topics: world history, evolution, world religions. The Histomap represents an impossible task of containing all of humanity's conflicts and progress. Its density mirrors Lipsett's profuse, rapid montage. As Lipsett's work evolved toward a greater and more ambiguous density, he returned again and again to a recorded interview that he had saved and transcribed, borrowed from another NFB project, between cybernetics philosopher Warren McCullough and Lipsett's NFB colleague Roman Kreuter, in which McCullough describes the concept of anastomotic knowledge that's fed by many strands of data, a philosophy of information that's tied to the image of a river fed by many branching paths. By the end of the 1960s, the search for an anastomotic method in art became the seed for Lipsett's conception of the collage film and of art making in general. In their day, Lipsett's films were considered funny. The NFB promoted them as wryly amusing, their ad copy noting that the films have, quote, humorous aspects. And at the end of the night, there wasn't a dry seat in the house. In the years since his tragic death, they have been regarded in a different light. And as such, the nature of his humor has seldom been addressed. It begins in a comedy of fast, mechanical rhythms to the end of perceptual impossibilities, its images passing at a greater speed than the mind can readily grasp or relate. Like the piano rolls of Conlon Nancarrow, punched to perform what human hands cannot, Lipsett allows the projector to see in ways that eyes cannot. Lipsett's humor assumes a growing sense of sardonic juxtaposition as, with each passing film, his rhythms even out, and the filmmaker spends more time meditating on the ridiculousness of life on Earth. His comedy tends to lie in a disparity between sound and image, which begins with contrasting and truncated rhythms, and later becomes a puckish vertical montage of motivated disagreement between elements. Nowhere is this clearer than in Fluxes, in which the testimony of Adolf Eichmann, there on trial in his glass booth, is replaced with the sounds, or is accompanied by the sounds of sitcoms and game shows. However, another absurdist aspect of Lipsett's work lies in his ability to condense a rapidly changing inventory of information and affect into the relative miniature of a short film. His films become, to use Robert S. Dupree's term, a copious inventory, one that, like the attempts of literary moderns of the early 20th century, tries to contain all the world in a work, or in the spirit of comic failure, whatever will fit. The copious inventory acts inversely to Stéphane Mallarmé's concept of the book to end all books, which tends to imagine an infinite container, the impossible promise of an eternal spine. The copious inventory finds its humor and its meaning in the hard limit of its container, and accordingly, its inevitable failure. This book considers Arthur Lipsett as an absurdist filmmaker whose astonishing resilience is reflected in the tragicomic gestures of his films. In charting his life and work, I seek to correct the narratives that dominate how Arthur Lipsett is remembered, often sentimentalized as a victim of society, a portrayal that obscures the worth and pleasure of the work itself. This portrayal of Lipsett has been advanced by critics writing in the wake of his suicide and in recent decades by the NFB itself. My account considers his last films as major, deliberated works of intention against the grain of a discourse that cannot separate them from the circumstances of his resignation or of his death. Lipsett's story is that of the universal homelessness of the poet in the 20th century and the avaricious, murderous climate of contemporary Western society. As the details of Lipsett's life and tragic end are widely known by those who would encounter his films, the films demand a separation of the work from their maker in order to see them clearly. Those who seek out a crushing sadness in Lipsett's films will find it. Those who seek out laughter will find that as well. This is the strength of their ambiguity. Without prejudice, without foreknowledge of the artist's illness and death, seeing these films as viewers first saw them, one finds a laughter that isn't quite joyful and a reprehension that isn't quite personal. In the films of Arthur Lipsett, even the redemption of laughter can't be trusted. At the same time, this book does not disavow his life as a context for his work. Lipsett was immersed in an environment of social criticism, and in his departure from the security of the NFB and the decline of his final years, he comes to reflect Artaud's conception of the artist suicided by society. With this book, I provide a key to the copious inventories of Lipsett's images to whatever degree this is possible. Lipsett's sources, what they represent and how he uses them, are brought into dialogue with what can be gleaned of his motives and from memoranda, proposals, charts, what he began late in his career to refer to as his secret museum, a label that is itself a strange and obscure joke. I deliberated on Lipsett's interest in the histomap as a structural template. Beginning in 1966, again, that copious inventory, the attempt to harness in miniature a totality of experience. However, the power of these films is, in the end, a result of his instinct, his rhythm, his will to totality, his sense of humor, his desire to play the holy fool to a straight world. These traits that give his films a lingering power also cast what can be known of his elusive sources, his motives, and his life into relative triviality. In some ways, it doesn't matter. The dust of life is stripped away, and only the work remains, the victory of an uncompromising mystic. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. So that you know, what you are going to see is Very Nice, 2187, and then a program that the NFB put together called Two Films by Lipsett, in which you will see Lipsett's next two films, Free Fall and A Trip Down Memory Lane, presented in a context, in a classroom context, with what today look like uncommonly well-spoken high school students. The NFB's attempt to explain things that they themselves were finding bewildering. This pads the length of films numbers 3 and 4, but after that there will be a short pause while we have a reel change, and then we will see fluxes followed by strange codes. I will be in the lobby to sign books, to talk, whatever you like. We will not be having a Q&A tonight. Arthur's not here to do it. So thank you all so much.